And I will be sharing that information, links to the YouTube and this webinar in follow-up emails and in the chat box once we get started. So I will allow John to run through the introductions, but here is the CM credit number listed. And just a couple of housekeeping items. We really, well, as you will see, this is an interactive webinar, but we do encourage questions. However, please submit all questions to the Q&A box versus the chat box, just to allow the panelists to keep tabs of everything. And again, this is being recorded, and I will share all that information to the YouTube page and to websites shortly. Thank you, and I will pass it over to John to introduce our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Jillian, and welcome everyone. My name is John Harbin, and we are going to share my screen here. Jillian, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Again, my name is John Harbin, and we will be going over the ethics cases of the year for 2022. This presentation was prepared by the Ethics Committee of Certified Planners, and it is presented by the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration, or MAPC. This is a group that consists of the Delaware, Maryland, National Capital Area, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia and North Carolina chapters of the American Planning Association, along with the Maryland Department of Planning, the Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, the Virginia Rural Planning Caucus, and the West Virginia Land Use and Sustainable Development Law Clinic. And the whole purpose of this group is to provide relevant professional development opportunities for planners in our region. So we are pleased to be here with you today to present the ethics cases of the year 2022. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We first have Mr. Scott Duncanson with us, AICP Lead Green Associate and Environmental Specialist. Mr. Duncanson is a Senior Environmental Planner and Project Manager at Gannett Fleming, a full-service engineering and planning consulting firm based in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. Mr. Duncanson is a certified planner with over 37 years of experience in the transportation, NEPA, environmental planning fields. Scott has worked on numerous NEPA environmental planning studies for transportation agencies, MPOs, transit providers, state departments of transportation, and federal agencies nationwide. Scott currently serves and is an active member of the APA Pennsylvania's Professional Development Committee. Scott received a BA in Political Science from the University of New Hampshire and a master's degree in Urban Affairs from Boston University. We are also joined by Ms. Lauren DeVore, AICP MSM. Ms. DeVore is a planner with a passion for shaping communities that foster a sense of place, preserve our natural resources, and consider the impact of our transportation system. She believes that anyone can be an agent of positive change within their community, and kindness is the best currency. With 14 years experience working at state and local government levels, Lauren has held positions with Delaware Department of Transportation, Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, and currently serves as a senior planner within Sussex County, Delaware's Department of Planning and Zoning. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from Wesley College and a Master of Science in Management with a concentration in organizational leadership from Wilmington University. We're supposed to be joined by Miss Leah Kacanda, AICP. Unfortunately, she is feeling under the weather today, so she will not be able to join us, but I wanted to acknowledge her as a panelist because she was integral in the planning of this webinar today. And again, my name is John Harbin. I serve as the Professional Development Officer for the American Planning Association Virginia chapter. And in my day job, I serve as a Senior Regional Planner for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. So the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to go over a brief refresh on planning ethics, talk about some of the code updates that were made recently, and then go over hopefully all 5 ethical scenarios. Now, we only have an hour today, and we really want to engage with you all as much as possible. So if we don't make it through all 5, that's okay. We really would like to encourage you all to participate as much as possible. We'll have interactive live polling throughout each scenario. And if you have any questions or comments, we encourage you to put those in the chat box or come off mute or raise your hand, and we'll be sure to address those. We'd really like to have an engaged conversation with you. I think that is how we best learn about these kind of challenging topics that we'll be discussing today. So a quick disclaimer about this. This session has been created to provide just a general education on the AICP Code of Ethics. And although this sort of question and answer session is an important part, all certified planners should be aware that only the AICP Ethics Committee is authorized to give formal advice on a planner's conduct as it relates to the Code of Ethics. If you have questions regarding a situation in your own professional practice, I would encourage you to seek informal advice from the AICP Ethics Officer. That is Ralph Wilmer. That and his email and phone number is listed here. You can also reach out to any trusted colleague or perhaps a chapter's board member for that informal advice, but only the AICP Ethics Committee is authorized to give formal advice as it relates to the conduct of professional planners. All right, and with that, I think I will turn it over to Mr. Scott Duncanson.
All right, thanks, John, and thanks for having me as part of the panel here. Looking forward to the session. All right, first off, I don't know how many folks out there have seen The Good Place. This was a TV show, a comedy show. I believe it was on NBC. I want to say circa 2016 through 2020. And why it's being featured here is it was a show about getting to the good place, you know, taking the elevator up once you leave this world as opposed to taking the elevator down. And one of the main characters on the show happened to be an ethics and philosophy professor in his previous life on Earth. And so the show really dealt with a lot of ethical issues and moral issues that face the characters and how you get to that good place or how you stay in that good place. So a few questions that were posed by the creator of the show that can apply to ethical scenarios. You know, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Is there something we could do that's better? And then why is it better? So I think the same thing can be said with our code of ethics and thinking about ethics in our profession. You know, what are we doing in our everyday jobs? How can we do it better? You know, if there is a better way of doing things. So John, next slide. Now the AICP, the APA has some ethical principles as well. Before we get into the AICP Code of Ethics. And I think what's important to note here is that these overall ethical principles for planning apply to advisors, advocates, and decision makers in the planning process. So if you're on a planning board and maybe there are other members who aren't AICP, if they're involved in the planning process, they are guided by these ethical principles. So these ethical principles involve serving the public interest, maintaining high standards of integrity and proficiency, and improving overall planning competence. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to get into the AICP ethics code. And I would encourage folks at the top left here, or there, I think there was, or no, bottom left is the website for the Code of Ethics. So I would encourage you, if you have a chance, to go to that website and take a peruse of the ethics code, especially since it was just updated. It was updated at the end of 2021 and put in place January 1st, 2022. As a part of the ethics code, there are 5 basic parts. The first part is the aspirational principles. Second part is the rules of conduct that AICP members are to follow. The third part is the advisory opinions that can be issued. The fourth part deals with how you deal with complaints of misconduct. And the last part deals with discipline of members. This is about a 20-page read, but it's really not that bad as it sounds, being 20 pages. There's AICP logo in the header, and they're very generous with their spacing of margins, so that it's really not a really long read at 20 pages. Next slide. Okay, this is what a couple slides here that I hope you get something out of, some key changes to the code that we want to make sure you know. If you haven't read the Code of Ethics, we want to make sure people are aware of these key changes that happened at the beginning of the year. There were some changes to the aspirational principles. They were reorganized. There's information on cultural biases. The equity foundation of plans is more front and center and a greater emphasis, and also an emphasis on promoting ethics. There were also some changes in the rules of conduct. They were reorganized to be a little more logically grouped under headings, and an emphasis on discrimination and harassment, some details on the ethics investigations, and claiming credit. So those are a couple of the key changes, and we'll talk about those further in the next few slides. Next slide. Okay, here are the, prior to 2022, there were 3 overall headings for the aspirational principles. Our overall responsibility to the public, our responsibility to our clients and employers, and our responsibility to our profession and our colleagues. All right, so try to remember those, and we're going to move to the next slide. And John, I may ask you to switch back to that one in a minute here. So here are the new principles that are in the new Code of Ethics that went into effect in January. Number 1, continuously pursue and faithfully serve the public interest. Number 2, do so with integrity. Number 3, work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity. 4, safeguard the public trust. And 5, improve planning knowledge and increase public understanding of planning activities. So we went from 3 to 5. John, if you can go back a second and just look at those 3 and just see, maybe folks can throw in the chat, where do you think the major change was? We had the overall responsibility to the public, responsibility to clients and employers, and responsibility to professions and our profession and colleagues. John, switch back. So, you know, which number, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, seems like it's different than what was there before? And I think the number that looks different to me that I didn't see before was number 3. Work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity. These were there in the aspirational principles before, but they were more of a subheading. So while they were there, they weren't front and center. So what was done this round was to put this front and center, work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity right in the aspirational principles so that it's more prominent and more front and center for folks. An important issue, probably something that I know when I got out of planning school 25 or 30 years ago, you know, economic, social, and racial equity was not at the top of what we learned in planning school. So our profession has continued to evolve, and the AICP Code of Ethics, you know, evolves as well. Next slide. Okay, with regard to the rules of conduct, there are now 24 rules, down from 26 rules. The rules have been reorganized and to fit into the following 7 categories: quality, integrity of practice, conflict of interest, improper influence, abuse of position, honesty and fair dealing, responsibility to employer, discrimination and harassment, and bringing and cooperating with an ethics charge. That's fine. Next slide. I guess lastly, there was a change with the appeal process. If there was a complaint that moved forward through the process. Only current members of AICP may appeal a determination of the ethics officer. This revision eliminates the ability of non-members to contest ethics rulings through a time-consuming appeal process. However, if you are a non-AICP member, you can still file an appeal if you can get an AICP member to do so on your behalf. So that was a change. I think there was felt maybe there were some frivolous claims from folks who weren't AICP. If their claim was denied, they still had the appeal process, and it was felt that a better change would be only an AICP member could file that appeal. So I hope from this opening session here, you know, you've seen the changes. We've at least introduced you to those changes that took place earlier this year. And again, I would encourage you, if you have a chance, to review those on the website. And I think I'm going to turn it over to John for the next few slides.
Thank you, Scott. So let's review some of the ethical misconduct cases that the AICP Ethics Committee reviewed in 2021. 18 total cases were dismissed. The vast majority of those, 13, were due to no justification to file a charge. 5 others were dismissed after preliminary charges were filed, and further investigation found them to be not worthy of disciplinary action. 6 cases did result in disciplinary actions, and these are the types of actions that were taken. There were 2 letters of confidential admonition for wrongful conduct, one for plagiarism and another for sexual harassment, 1 public letter of admonition for misstating facts and using others' efforts to seek professional recognition, 1 indefinite suspension for a repeat offense of wrongful conduct, this time involving text messages containing derogatory comments about a city council member, 1 revocation of AICP for working 2 public jobs simultaneously without having notified either employer. This probably was the result of our COVID remote working environment. And I will note that the person who was subject to this action was terminated from both of those public jobs. And 1 permanent revocation of AICP and FAICP for continuing use of the credentials after they were revoked several years ago for a serious crime. Now, 1 interesting point I'd like to make, and thanks for Scott for digging this up, but 3 out of the 6 cases that resulted in disciplinary actions had to do with folks with FAICP credentials, which I find somewhat interesting, seeing that FAICPs you would think would be very knowledgeable on the code of ethics and perhaps less likely to receive disciplinary actions, but that didn't seem to be the case in 2021. So of all the ethics topics that were submitted based on misconduct cases and informal inquiries, the vast majority have to do with quality/integrity of practice, and then on down from there, honesty and fair dealing, improper influence or abuse of position, responsibility to employer, and conflict of interest, and so forth. I will note that conflict of interest several years ago used to be the top subject area for ethics topics, but that has since gone down to number 5. So perhaps the profession is having less of an issue with conflict of interest, or perhaps something else is at play there. But most of the inquiries and ethic misconduct cases result or have to do with quality and integrity of practice. So of all the ethics cases and calls, I'll point your attention to this map here. This is the states that they originated from in 2021. As you can see in Virginia and in several of the other mid-Atlantic states, it's a relatively lower number of cases and calls. I will note that some similar sized states as some in the mid-Atlantic, such as North Carolina, maybe Colorado, had a significantly higher number of cases and calls. That's something you'd probably expect in states like California and Florida and Texas, but somewhat interesting that smaller states such as North Carolina had a higher number there. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Anyone can make an informal inquiry to the ethics officer that just gets logged, and that just means that they're engaged, I think, with the code of ethics and working to uphold it in their professional practice. So in these following cases of the year, obviously, these were based on real world inquiries that were made to the ethics officer and the ethics committee in 2021. Although they were based on real life situations, all of the relevant names, details, and locations are fictional for privacy purposes. So our cast of characters, briefly, we'll have several different types of planners, planning directors, consultants, and a planning intern, and we'll have a city manager that will play a role in some of our scenarios. All right, so let's kick it off with our first scenario, misrepresenting public views. So Joyce, AICP, is a staff planner with Whitley County. Recently, a summary of the public engagement process for a new county land use plan was released. After reviewing this summary, which was prepared by Joyce's supervisor, Joyce doesn't believe it accurately represents many of the issues raised by residents in a series of focus groups and community meetings that were part of the planning process. Joyce discusses this with other staff planners, some of whom are AICP members as well, and her supervisor, who is not AICP. But virtually everyone tells Joyce to forget about it, especially given the county's volatile partisan politics. In fact, her supervisor tells her directly, this is not a fight worth fighting. Okay, so we're going to kick off our first question, and I'm going to ask Jillian to go ahead and pull up our poll here. Does Joyce have an ethical obligation under the AICP Ethics Code to do something further regarding this issue? So hopefully you have the poll in front of you now. We have lots of responses coming in. This is great. Many are saying yes. Some are saying no, and a good number of people just aren't quite sure. I mean, she's already confronted her supervisor and her other colleagues about this?
I'm going to allow it to get to 70% before I end the poll already.
All right, so 61% said yes, she should do something further regarding this. 27 aren't sure, and we have 11% saying she's done enough. Interesting. All right, our next question. Is Joyce's supervisor guilty of violating the AICP ethics code? Now remember, her supervisor is not AICP. All right, almost to 70%. All right, so only 12% said yes. Wow. 73% no, and 14% not sure. All right. Okay, well, Lauren, I will ask you to chime in now and discuss some of the ethical issues with this scenario.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would just like to first begin by thanking Mr. Harbin for having us as guests today. I really appreciate that, and also the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaborative. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Duncanson and also Leah. I know that she's unable to be here today, as well as Jillian and my amazing team with the Sussex County government. We are the largest county here in Delaware, representing over 25 municipalities and in excess of 230,000 people. So really appreciate you all. It's an honor to be here today. So to begin, there are a couple of ethical issues that we need to be aware of with this. So first of all, under APA's ethical principles in planning, A1 tells us that we are to recognize the rights of citizens to participate in planning decisions. We need to have that public participation process. Otherwise, it's not a planning process. So very important. And B11 tells us not to misrepresent facts or distort information for the purpose of achieving a desired outcome. We also see that there are several aspirational principles that are applicable to this, namely providing timely, adequate, clear, accessible, and accurate information on planning issues to all affected persons. We are also called to serve as advocates for the public or private sector, but only when the client's objectives are legal and consistent with the public interest. Additionally, under the aspirational principles, it's important to note that under 1F, we as planners must apply ethical principles in serving the public. And that as part of that, we're to hold individuals accountable for their conduct. And on the public interest side, we have a duty to safeguard the public trust under aspirational principle number 4. And this includes not deliberately committing any wrongful act, whether or not it's specified in the rules of conduct, which reflects adversely on the planning process, and knowingly and deliberately misrepresenting public views would certainly fall under being a wrongful act in the planning profession and in general. Next, John. Okay, so continuing under the rules of conduct, we have rule number 1, which is certainly applicable in this case. We shall not deliberately fail to provide adequate, timely, clear, and accurate information on planning issues. And we also have rule number 5, which is we shall not direct or pressure other professionals to make analysis or reach findings not supported by available evidence. And this information would therefore fall under the blanket of quality and integrity of practice. And as was noted in the beginning slides, quality and integrity of practice did hold the largest number of misconduct cases and inquiries in 2021 at 64 cases total. So this is certainly something that is worth being more aware of moving forward. Next slide, please, John. And will you be discussing the real life outcome, or would you
Sure,
like to
I'll
cover
be
that?
happy to.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was a great recap of the applicable sections of the Code of Ethics and Aspirational Principles. So the real life outcome for Joyce, after contacting the AICP ethics officer for informal advice, which is a great idea, the ethics officer tells Joyce that she has fulfilled her part of her ethical obligations by informing her supervisor of her concerns. However, it would be even better if she provided her concerns in writing, just as proof. Since Joyce is not personally involved in the misrepresentation, she has not acted ethically, even though others have not, including her supervisor. She has acted ethically, even though others have not, including her supervisor in this case. All right, before we move on from this, I'd like to see if there's any questions in the chat. And if anyone would like to make a comment, Jillian, perhaps if someone's raising their hand, we can give them an opportunity now to ask any questions related to this scenario.
Alrighty, I believe we did have one question from a Nick Neese. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the last name. I've just granted talking abilities.
Hi, Nick. What's your question or comment? Nick, if you're asking it, we can't hear you. Perhaps if you put it in the chat. Oh, I think I see you said it was a mistake.
Alrighty, no worries.
That's no problem. We do have a comment from Alex Long stating that there's not enough information for this scenario. That's often the case, that these scenarios, they typically omit maybe some key details just to make the conversation and the thought process a little more challenging. It's not always black and white. Oftentimes there's a lot of gray space in between there. So I agree, we could have definitely benefited from more information. There likely was in this real world case that they just omitted for the scenario purposes. All right, without further questions, I will go ahead and move on in the sake of time here. Okay, so we're going to move on to a scenario on planning competence. Odelia, who's a recent graduate and an AICP candidate, is a planning intern for the city of Suarez. 2 months ago, her supervisor, the planning director, resigned. Since then, and at the direction of her city manager, Odelia has taken on most of the planning director's responsibilities, including site plan review. Odelia tells the city manager, however, that site plan review is, quote, way beyond my level of training and experience. Despite these protests, Sam tells Odelia, the city manager, that he has been very satisfied with her work. However, Odelia is concerned that she may be violating one of the rules of conduct, number 3, in the AICP Ethics Code, which states, "We shall not accept work beyond our professional competence." She is worried this could affect her chances of becoming AICP.
Hey, John, before you move on, I just want to make sure people are aware what an AICP candidate means. And
Sure.
what that means is a few years ago, APA piloted a program where you were allowed to take the AICP exam before you met all of your work years of experience responsibility. So for someone who's maybe fresh out of planning school and into the, hey, I know how to take these standardized tests, I'm ready to take the test now, but I don't have the experience, and you pass the test, that's what an AICP candidate is, someone who's passed the test, but is in that period where they're waiting to gain their experience to be an AICP planner.
Yep, thank you for that, Scott. All right. So in this scenario, do we think Odelia is guilty of ethical misconduct? And I'll ask Jillian to go ahead and initiate the poll.
Give me one moment.
As folks are taking that, I will note we've had several questions come in on the Q&A. What is the threshold of distortion? Plenty of situations allow for different interpretations as it relates to the previous scenario. I agree. Writing and views are very subjective. And if someone knows that someone behaved unethically, can they be held accountable for misconduct if they did not report it? Ooh, Lauren, do you want to take a stab at that one?
My apologies, I was having some audio issues there. Yeah, so I think it's important that we always document our findings in writing. So I'm definitely in support of her writing down her objections, making sure that it's on the record. I know that it is our duty as staff to remain neutral, but if you see something, say something. I think it's always important to do the right thing and to act ethically. So that's something that I do believe in.
Great. I think that's a great response. Thank you, Lauren. All right. So the results of the poll, we have only 8% saying that Odelia is guilty of ethical misconduct. Vast majority say no, and a significant portion are not sure. All right. Interesting. All right. Let's do the next question. Could a code violation impact Odelia's potential AICP certification, even though she is just an AICP candidate, as we've discussed? Right. Thanks for your participation in these. We're almost to 70%. All right, so most of them say yes. 68% say that this code violation would impact Odelia's potential AICP certification. Still a significant say they are not sure. All right. Scott, I'm going to let you discuss what these results mean. One more question though. Should Odelia tell her supervisor that someone else needs to be hired to perform some of her planning tasks? Sounds like she probably already maybe said something to that effect, but should she say it outright? Of course, that's a hard position to be in if you're a new employee and you want to take on new projects and prove yourself. It's tempting to not ask that. All right, so 79% say yes, she should tell her supervisor that someone else needs to be hired to perform some of these tasks. So that's overwhelming majority say yes. All right, Scott, do you want to break this down for us?
Yes, will do. And kudos to the folks who are answering the polling questions. While there's no right or wrong, I think the majority of folks had their answers in the right place there. So I don't know if they're cheating, if we've got an open book here, but really doing a great job on answering those questions. So there are a couple of things to think about here in terms of the ethical principles in planning. Don't participate in any matter unless adequately prepared and sufficiently capacitated to render thorough and diligent service, and then accurately represent their qualifications to practice planning as well as their education and affiliations. The aspirational principles of the ethics code exercise fair, honest, skilled, informed, and independent professional judgment, serve as advocates for the public or private sector only when the client's objectives are legal and consistent with the public interest, and do not participate in any matter unless adequately prepared to be able to render thorough and diligent services. Now, I presented this recently or 2 weeks ago at the APA conference, and then also at the APA Delaware planning conference. And I think folks there said, boy, this is a really extreme case that you're an intern and you're essentially being thrown into the role as the planning director. So while this is an extreme case, folks also expressed that this happens all the time in terms of if you're a new employee, maybe you're learning something new, you're taking on responsibility, but you're probably just not thrown in as going from intern to executive director or planning director, which this case is. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this was an important point, and you guys really picked up on this. When preparing to take the AICP exam, an AICP candidate, agrees that they'll abide by the AICP Code of Ethics. So for sure, if she was doing something wrong, this could jeopardize her getting her AICP. So a couple of the rules of conduct here that could come into play. We shall not deliberately fail to provide adequate, timely, clear, and accurate information. So I think she's concerned whether she's got that knowledge and experience to be able to do that. And probably more importantly, rule number 3, we shall not accept work beyond our professional competence, but may, with understanding and agreement of the client or employer, accept such work to be performed under the direction of another professional competent to perform the work and acceptable to the client and employer. So really, I think what you're looking for here is that you have a mentor. If it's something that's beyond your expertise and your knowledge and skill base, that you're working with someone who can direct you on how to do that properly if you don't have someone to actually do that. Next slide.
Right. Thank you, Scott. So what happened in this case? The AICP ethics officer advises Odelia that based on her background in the city manager's oversight, she does not appear to have violated the AICP ethics code. However, the ethics officer suggests that Odelia should urge her supervisor, the city manager, Sam, to hire a replacement planning director or temporary consultant as soon as possible. In the meantime, Odelia should contact her APA chapter or APA Learn on the APA's website about potential site plan review courses and possibly finding an experienced professional mentor. So to your point, Scott, it's really important to get trained and have that professional mentorship if she's going to remain in this sort of role. But she should absolutely ask for someone to come in and take on those duties in the interim. Let's see, any other points you'd like to make on that one, Scott? See if there's anything in the chat. We have one comment saying there's a strong potential for bias on who is deemed competent.
Yeah, and John, why don't we go to the next slide? And with some of these cases for this year, APA has provided a few slides to point out where there were changes in the code that affect this scenario. So the old rule on conduct number 15 says we shall not accept work beyond our professional competence unless the client or employer understands and agrees that such work will be performed by another professional competent to perform the work that is acceptable to the client or employer. Now that was changed around a little bit here. The new rule of conduct number 3 starts out the same, but this allows to accept such work to be performed under the direction of another professional. So before, if you couldn't do the work, it was to be done by someone else. Now they've made provisions for if it's work that's beyond your competence, you can perform that work as long as it's under the direction of another professional. So I think they're allowing for those cases for younger folks, younger planners who are learning and can do so under the direction of someone else who's competent to perform that work and direct you. So I think in this case, this allows people to take on responsibility, maybe a little beyond their what they would normally do, but as long as they're doing it under direction of someone mentoring them, that's okay. And again, at the last two conferences where we presented, folks who responded and who provided input, had indicated this happens a lot in your work experience. You're going to run up against things that you haven't done before, that it's going to be new to you. And again, as opposed to accepting something that you don't know how to do, it's best if you don't know how to do that work or haven't done that, to do that under the guidance of someone who can mentor you and help you along with that new process, that new experience. I think folks thought, especially at the APA conference, that, hey, if you said you couldn't do that, if Odelia said, boy, I can't do this, would they be looked on, or frowned upon if they said no? You're, as a younger employee, are you supposed to be looking to take on those things, looking to take on that work, but asking the right questions so that you can learn new skills and perform new tasks to expand your resume? Yeah, I saw what Jeffrey Harvey had just posted there, that this is similar to an EIT, an engineer in training. The AICP candidate is definitely something that's very much like that EIT, and learning under the guidance of others.
I think Stacy brings up a good question too, in terms of who will be deemed a professional, a competent enough to oversee someone performing the work. That's a question that I think is a bit unanswered and will depend on a case-by-case basis. But obviously, if they're doing site plan work, then that the person overseeing them should be well versed in site plan review in similar matters.
Yeah, and it surely can be subjective, but I want to say the fact that you've at least acknowledged that, and reached out for that, I think you're headed in the right place. Certainly, you could be directed to someone who maybe isn't as the right person to advise you, but at least you've reached out and you've made that attempt and let folks know that's beyond your capability. Someone asked the question, Stacy asked about the credential. Does an AICP candidate place after your name? And it is AICP candidate. Does your employer understand the difference? I guess it would depend on your employer. If they are in the planning profession, if they are an APA member or an AICP candidate, hopefully they know. But again, that AICP candidate started only 5 or 6 years ago in 2016 as a pilot program, and it has since become adopted. So it is still fairly new for folks to know about that. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Stacy.
All right. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to move forward. Our next scenario, which is conflict of interest. In this case, Peter, AICP, is a planning consultant and has a contract to serve as a staff planner for the village of Waterbury. A developer hires Peter to provide expert witness testimony at a meeting of the Columbia Planning Commission on behalf of a proposed gas station and convenience store. The site is located less than 300 feet from the Columbia-Waterbury border. After Peter testifies, a resident of Columbia files a complaint with Waterbury's ethics board, alleging that Peter's private testimony constitutes a conflict of interest because of the project's proximity to the community where Peter works as the village planner. The resident also alleges in a misconduct complaint to AICP that Peter has violated the AICP ethics code because he had input into Columbia's comprehensive plan in his role as the staff planner for Waterbury. Okay, so do we think that Peter has a conflict of interest in this scenario, providing that testimony in a neighboring jurisdiction? All right, we have responses coming in here. Pretty mixed results. Let's see here. Only about half of folks think that, yes, Peter does have a conflict of interest. About a quarter say no, and about 20% are not sure. Pretty split here. This is a tough one. All right. Next question is, has Peter violated any rules of conduct in the AICP ethics code? Again, wow. Pretty split response here. I'll give folks another moment here. So only 38% say yes, 27% say no, and 35% are not sure. Wow. Scott, what's your take on this?
Yeah, and I'm going to try to roll through this one a little more quickly because I think there's one more good scenario that we want to get to before we close, and we're starting to run low on time. I would say this one was a tougher one. I would have liked to have had a little more information on this one to be able to make that decision. We aren't supposed to undertake employment in planning or related profession without having made full written disclosure to our employer and having received written permission. It's unclear. There weren't enough facts, I think, in this case to know that. And then also Rule 19, we cannot accept an assignment or publicly advocated position on a planning issue significantly different from a position we publicly advocated for. And I think that was the question of whether he worked on the other municipalities' plan or not. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Okay, so following a review, the ASB ethic officer asked Peter to provide a written response, and Peter responded that his involvement with the Columbia plan had been advisory. His employment contract with Waterbury did not have language preventing outside employment, and his expert witness testimony had not constituted a conflict of interest according to a ruling by the Waterbury's ethics board. So I think that would have been important for us to know to make better judgment on that case. Although the misconduct complaint is dismissed, the AICP Ethics Committee sends Peter a confidential advisory letter which recommends that his future decisions regarding consulting jobs should be more carefully considered. And quickly to the next slide, I think there was a change, with the aspirational principle did not include and their unintended consequences. Rule 4 says unless an employer has a written policy permitting such employment. So now, if your employer has a policy that permits that, then you're okay. But in no case shall a planner engage in outside work that would create an actual conflict of interest. So I think there was definitely a perceived conflict of interest. The City of Waterbury Ethics Committee said no, but it would have been nice to have a little bit more of that information before we voted. So let's get to the next case because I think this one's an important one.
All right, great. Thank you, Scott. So our next scenario relates to equity and inclusion. Jane, AICP, is Jacobson County's planning director. She learns that a member of the county board, non-AICP, has been lobbying members of the county planning commission to delete equity/inclusion portions of its new draft comprehensive plan before it is submitted to the county board for approval. The county board member apparently doesn't want to make these comments in a public meeting. Okay, does Jane have an ethical obligation to tell her supervisor what she's heard about the county board member lobbying the County Planning Commission. All right, we have a lot of responses coming in. Overwhelmingly, yes. People believe that she does have an ethical obligation. Next question is, if her supervisor does nothing, does Jane have an ethical obligation to do something else about this situation? Not quite the same consensus on this question. So pretty evenly split here. 40%, only 40% say yes, she does have she should do something else. 32% say no, and 28% are just not sure. Okay, Lauren, what's your take on this?
Okay, so definitely relevant today, certainly. And digging into our aspirational principles, we can see that there certainly is more of an emphasis with the Code of Ethics on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important for us to remember that these are not just buzzwords, okay? These are facets that we need to be implementing in our daily roles. Namely, we are to create plans that ensure equitable access to resources and opportunities. And again, we are to serve as advocates for the public sector, so long as those objectives are legal and consistent with the public interest. And furthermore, aspirational principle 1A states that we must examine our conscious and unconscious biases as an essential first step so that we can better serve a truly inclusive public interest, promoting a sense of belonging. And additionally, Section 1C also tells us that as planners, we need to have special concern for the long range consequences of past and present actions. So with this in mind, it's important to note that the actions that we take as planners every single day can have far-reaching implications. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so digging into our rules of conduct, rules number 9 and 10 have been flagged as being applicable here. So we are not to engage in private communications with planning process participants if the discussions relate to a matter over which we have the authority to make a binding final determination. And under rule number 10, again, we can't engage in private communications with decision makers. That's just not a good look for us at all. And the preamble to the Code of Ethics also states that we as planners are to balance the many competing agendas with careful consideration of the facts and context. So with that said, I envision the planning process as being kind of a set of scale balances, with integrity being at the base and the fundamental core of the balance, having public interest on one side of the scale and the responsibility to our employer on the other side of the scale. And one of the many challenges and plights that we face as planners is how we balance these two elements. And the best planners are those that are able to see that spectrum of gray that exists between them and to tactfully navigate that. Next slide, please, John.
Thanks, Lauren. That's a great sort of picture that you just put in my mind with the balancing of scales. I really like that. So for the real life outcome for this scenario, after Jane requests informal advice, the AICP ethics officer suggests that she should discuss this matter with first her supervisor, who's the county administrator, and then second, the chair of the county planning commission, as this lobbying activity could be a violation of state or local laws. The ICMA Code of Ethics, which governs the county administrator in this case, also has applicable language here addressing this issue regarding inclusion. And furthermore, although none of the planning commission members are AICP members, as we've discussed, the ethical principles in planning apply to all of those who participate in the process of planning as advisors, advocates, and decision makers. So that absolutely includes members of the Planning Commission. Lauren, do you want to review some of the impacts of the new code here?
Sure. So digging back into our principles, our aspirational principles, we can see that under Principle 1E, we're to incorporate equity principles and strategies as the foundation for preparing our plans and implementation programs. That's fairly new language that has been embedded into the code. And additionally, people who participate in the planning process shall work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity. And so I will wrap up this section by noting a very relevant quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who stated that the time is always right to do what is right. So let's all do our part to act with the quality and integrity of practice that best reflects the best of our profession rather than the worst of our profession. And I'm going to hand it back over to you, John.
Great. Lauren, I think I couldn't have ended it any better way than with that quote. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to respect everyone's time. I see it's 1:03. I figured we probably wouldn't make it through all 5 scenarios, and that's okay. You can still earn your CM credit. This does qualify for the ethics credit, of course. I think Jillian put that in the chat earlier, but it's also part of the Zoom registration as well. So please reference that. We want to thank you all for participating. Thank you for your poll responses, your chat conversations. And I also want to provide my deepest gratitude to our panelists, Ms. Lauren DeVore and Mr. Scott Duncanson. Thank you to you both for your expertise and your insights this afternoon. We truly appreciate it. And we thank you all for being part of this Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration webinar. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, John, Lauren, and Scott. A follow-up e-blast will be going out to all attendees in the coming days. And you will also be able to see the recording of this webinar if you'd like to share it to anyone who might have missed it, or if you want to go back and listen on MAPC's YouTube page, which will also be included in the follow-up. But thank you all for joining.